Hello and welcome to Demystifying Poetry, the podcast that brings everyone closer to poets and poems. I am your host, Tara Stubbs, and this episode my guest is Liz Ison. Hello Liz, you're very welcome.
Hi, great to be here, Tara.
Liz trained with and worked for the charity The Reader and has been running shared reading groups for many years, in person and online, including an intergenerational group in a care home. She has also delivered workshops on the transformative power of poetry, following the publication of an anthology that she compiled entitled A Poem to Read Aloud Every Day of the Year, encouraging a daily poetry habit, and her Taylor Swift-themed anthology, Poems for Tortured Souls. She is a museum and gallery educator at the Charles Dickens Museum and the National Portrait Gallery, and she also leads poetry walks in partnership with the Poetry Pharmacy and has actually led a walk with me quite recently in Oxford as well. So we're really happy to have you here today, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've had a really wide, I think, and quite eclectic experience around poetry and audiences. And you mentioned earlier that you don't actually write poems yourself, which is something I have in common with you. I've written a couple, but not for, public consumption. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into the projects that you have been doing.
Yes, I very much think of myself as a reader of poetry rather than a writer of poetry. And one of the key things that happened was I got involved with a charity called The Reader back in 2015. It's kind of like a literature and wellbeing charity, but what they like to do is to train up volunteers to read shared reading groups, where we often read poetry, and that works really, really well as short stories and extracts. And it's kind of all about using poetry kind of as a tool to make people connect with each other and with the literature. So it's all about kind of how you receive the poetry. Mm-hmm. And I found that really kind of transformative from thinking of it as maybe an academic subject that you studied at school or university to something that was really important for your own sort of personal development and having a personal relationship with poetry. I was wondering, Tara, as instead of just falling into the trap of talking about poetry, whether I could read you a few lines of a poem in a way a bit like how we might do in a shared reading group.
That would be lovely.
So I've got just a few lines from John Keats' poem Endymion. So what I'll do is I'm just gonna read it to our podcast listeners. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing.
It's lovely. Thank you.
One of the things that we do when I'm leading a group, when other volunteers are leading poetry groups, is to take it really slowly like that and to give the poem a lot of space. So, the pause before and the pause after, and kind of also space within the lines as well. Before we kind of start talking about it, I might then ask the group about that word, say, find a way of getting into the poem in a way that makes you connect with it. So a thing of beauty, I might pick up on that because when you're at school, the English teachers go, don't use the word thing. that's really not a great word. It's not doing much. But here, a thing of beauty, so it's kind of quite open, isn't it? So then the group might start to talk about for themselves what that thing of beauty might be.
Is it the poem or is it something else? Yeah.
Is it the poem? Yes. Is it a loved one, or could it be something to do with memory? And it's so interesting if you keep it really wide like that, how people will come in with all sorts of interesting and unexpected things that you weren't
things.
Yeah, exactly. There we go.
I like the way that it echoes into the nothingness as well on the third line.
Yes.
So that's a kind of no thing, I suppose. It's kind of saying it always retains its thingness.
Yes. I mean, you see, I've done this poem so many times and I didn't notice that the word thing is in nothingness.
And then at the end of breathing as well, I guess, you've also got thing.
Brilliant. Oh, that's fantastic, Tara. And what I would do then is because you've immediately connected with other words in the poem, so I might sort of say, well, would you mind reading those lines again, and let's see if we can kind of feel it a bit more.
Okay. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but it still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. It's really interesting, I think, as well, because I noticed when you read it out that the enjambments are quite important, but they almost make you slightly glaze over the end rhyme. So there are end rhymes, but because you keep going and it's quite soporific. I suppose that's the idea, isn't it? You don't necessarily notice the rhyme so much.
That's really really observation. Yeah, well, we could probably end up talking about this
just for the whole time.
for the whole time. But the other thing that is really powerful in the groups is to hear it in different voices. So your reading of it, and your kind of maybe where you emphasised words or the ending, kind of brings more different meaning. So that's just like to show just the importance of the human voice and you as an individual in the group and what you can bring to these sort of old words.
So would that be the kind of thing that you would do in your shared reading groups? Do you do it the same sort of thing, if you go to the care home or if you do it in different contexts? Is that what you would do, or would you change the material slightly depending?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose it does depend, but a poem like this, an extract, I'd probably do a few more lines than this one. I could very much do that with any group, I think. I've run groups with school children, people in care homes, community groups, library groups, some people with living with dementia. And I think this is the sort of thing that you can do with anyone. And that's what's so incredible, that you can take the same words and people will respond in their own way. What's even better is when you've got diversity within the group, and people kind of learn from each other, and I think it helps to really break down barriers actually between people, old and young, or whatever those kind of barriers might be.
So what have you found, what have you come across when you've been working with different communities? Are there any odd experiences that stand out or anything unusual?
Well, I think I sort of noticed the commonality, really. A great poem can do that. That people react profoundly to literature, whoever they are. And I suppose one of the things I try to do is to not make assumptions when I go to a group. I mean, I often am quite scared when I go in and think, okay, I'm going to take a bit of Shakespeare today or a bit of Coleridge or whatever. And, something maybe quite challenging. And I'm thinking, well, is this going to just fall flat? It takes a bit of bravery to do it. And sometimes you're reading to people and then they're not engaged, or, I've had people fall asleep. And
I have as well when lecturing. I wouldn't worry.
but sometimes it's those people actually who are actually having the most profound response.
Really?
So one time I thought this woman in a sheltered accommodation was just having a nap, but I kind of carried on reading to her and sort of looking at her, and then the next day her key worker actually emailed me and said that she wanted to let me know that she had just wanted to listen with her eyes closed, and that in fact she wanted a notebook so she could copy out the poems that we'd been reading. So that has always kind of remained with me, and I thought, you never really know how people are responding, and I think that's it's quite exciting actually, and quite special about this process.
And I think when you and I ran that walk in Oxford as well, we thought a bit about how sometimes people don't really know how something has affected them until a while later, that you might take initial feedback in the moment, but that's going to be quite different from, say, 2 weeks later.
Yes.
And they thought, actually, that moment really made me think, and I've just realised the effect of it. I think sometimes poetry has a longer term effect, which is sometimes harder to sell in a very, fragmented world, I suppose, when people want kind of immediate responses, don't they?
I think that's right. I mean, I've talked to people about, sort of done these workshops where I kind of ask, about how people interact with poetry, over their lives, or how often do they read a poem, that sort of thing. And often people are talking, and same with me, thinking back to school, and can remember the poems that they read at school, and that's a very sort of seminal moment. Sometimes it's a negative one, but it still remained with them. Yeah, and then I think the other aspect of that kind of long-term thing is about rereading. So I sometimes think, if you bring a poem that's new to people, then when if they come across it again, they'll have those kind of memories, familiarity perhaps, from the discussion, from reading it. And it kind of deepens that relationship you have with the poem. So I think these things can take years, maybe, or lifetimes.
And you could come back to them at a time when you need them more, perhaps, than you did, or where they have more resonance than they did, possibly. Because I'm wondering, when you're talking from the Keats poem, I was thinking this idea of something lasting forever is going to be something that probably for people who are towards the end of their lives and are struggling with memory might be something quite beautiful for them to think about. That something like that is less perhaps interesting to a young person who doesn't really think about those issues yet. But when you're coming towards the end of your life, that might be a real consolation to think about that, particularly if you're struggling with memory and things like that.
Yes, but somehow you have to start young with people with poetry, so that in a way that once they get old, then they've got all that behind them.
Well, we were talking the other day in one of the other podcasts about how people often are very comfortable with poetry at primary school. I've just judged the competition for primary school children, and everybody just was really happy to. It was like loads of entrants. Even my 5-year-old son, who's 5 at the time, wrote one, and no one was really worried about it. But once you get sort of senior school, at least sort of 14 plus onwards, people are much more self-conscious. They're much more worried about what their poems how they might be received. So there's something happens where they lose that spontaneity and kind of engagement, I think. Perhaps because it becomes formally part of the education, but I think it might be more than that as well. There's something quite exposing and vulnerable about writing poetry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just wanted to go back to what you're saying about, I suppose, internalising stuff. There's this kind of interesting idea that I read about in a magazine produced by The Reader, called The Reader, quite a few years back, by a guy called Mark Rees, and he talked about the idea of an inner anthology. And I just really loved that idea that everyone has their own sort of unique anthology. That's that beautiful. Maybe they're kind of carrying around, might just have like a line in, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. It might change as you get older.
That famous Keats line, beauty is truth, truth beauty.
Oh, that would be in yours, would it, Tara?
Definitely,
yeah. And so everyone's is unique, and I think that's what I'm trying to do, perhaps subconsciously, is to develop my own sort of inner anthology that you take with you
and encourage it in others, I suppose, as well, to develop their own inner anthology.
Yes,
I love that. I'm thinking about what mine would be now.
Oh yeah, you start writing it down.
Yeah.
In Cranford, Elizabeth Gaskell's short novel, there's this character called Mr. Holbrook, who's a sort of gentleman farmer, not had a great not had much of an education, I don't think, and he's described he's showing these visitors around his farm, and he just interjects lines of poetry as he's talking, and Gaskell kind of describes that as almost as if he were thinking aloud, so as if the words were really part of him, and you couldn't tell which was verse and which was conversation. And I don't know if that's something that was more common in the good old days, when we people memorized stuff more.
And I guess it probably was, I would guess, but I wouldn't know for sure.
And Virginia Woolf talks about her father, Leslie Stevens, kind of marching around Kensington Gardens, reciting very loudly poetry, and with sort of great stride, the strides of his steps as part of the rhythm of the poetry. Yeah, I mean, those guys have really got it internalised.
I think that's why what you do is quite unique in a way, because I think there is a lot of performance poetry now and a lot of poetry readings, but they're usually or almost always poems that those people have written, right? Whereas what you're doing is practicing reading poems by other people aloud. and almost re-evoking that oral tradition. And, I have to admit, when we went to the pub and we were reading out loud the other week in Oxford, I felt a bit self-conscious, and I'm thinking, if I'm doing this poetry podcast, it's slightly hypocritical of me to feel self-conscious reading out. But I think in academic circles, often you don't get that very much. Sometimes we interview students and we give them a poem and they say, can I read it out? And we say, oh, sorry, we haven't really got time. So we don't really do it unless we're giving a lecture or something. It's in a very specific academic context. It's not in the pub while other people are talking about the football match or whatever.
Yeah.
So what you're doing, I think, is actually quite subversive in a quite subtle way. That it's making, because you talked about taking up space, but I think it takes up physical space as well, doesn't it? This act of reading. It's not just the space of the poem that takes up the time, but it's actually the act of the reading and the fact that, you encourage people to read it again and again sometimes, which is quite unusual, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's quite a simple, straightforward idea, but it is incredibly, I like to be called subversive, but it's certainly very powerful. And I think it also helps with memory, because I don't know if this will have affected you, Tara, but maybe whenever you come across Ozymandias, which is what we read in the pub.
Which is one of my favourite poems, I might add as well.
So perhaps part of your memory now will be reading it in that pub,
it will be,
with this kind of group of strangers.
The minute you said Ozymandias, I thought of the light in the head of the river and the way that we were sitting there with those strangers.
Gosh.
Yeah, that's my immediate response now.
And I feel like having that kind of physical sense, physical presence, if you like, really... does help with memory. So I've become more interested in not just the reading aloud and the reading together, but the kind of where you read and how that might affect.
And that might disrupt things. Yeah.
Yes, I suppose that's why you're saying sort of subversive, maybe, because it's slightly disruptive.
Have they ever had a poetry reading in that pub before? And yet, as you were saying, it's really appropriate, because that's exactly what Oxford people of yore would have done.
Yes.
We've just forgotten how to do it.
Yes, and you've got to just get over... I mean, I'm quite a shy person, but I just sort of went for that. And I don't think I've read in a pub before. I've read in cafes and church halls and all, in the middle of a busy library, we're running a group, and these people are kind of walking around getting their books. And
where do you think would be the most subversive space then to read poetry? Maybe, I don't know, House of Commons? Trying to think.
I don't know, but I've kind of played around with it a bit, because I had when we were working in central London, the reader had this relationship with historic royal palaces. There was a community access scheme at Kensington Palace, and they were trying to encourage local groups to come in to the palace and just run their groups inside, because there's sort of perceived barrier. I mean, there's a paywall. It's quite expensive to go, so they were letting these groups in for free. So I ran some reading groups there, and I was trying to work out, well, how should I make the reading and the space interact? It's such a grand place. It's all about Queen Victoria and the Georgians, and should we read about kings and queens? And I did a bit of that. We read a bit of Queen Victoria's diaries, which was fun. And then I was just tried to make it a bit different. So there was a beautiful clock in one of the rooms, a kind of musical clock. I think something played Handel's music or something. So I chose a poem by Thomas Hardy, The Broken Appointment, I think it's called, about him. I can't remember if he was standing somebody up or he was being stood up. I can't remember now. But it's nothing to do with the clock or the period or anything. But it was about time and clocks, and so that just made the whole experience a bit. I wouldn't say subversive, but just a bit different.
Yes.
So then we went to look at the clock afterwards, and you saw it in a slightly different way. And so just there's sort of that kind of that sense of space and, I don't know, and tradition, and so you can just play around with it, I think, and it's quite creative. Then it adds another dimension.
Yeah, and I think another thing that you do that actually is really brave is you don't really know who's going to come on some of these events that you organise, particularly with the walks. So have you found anything surprising about the people who've come on them? I mean, we had somebody who said they didn't like poetry and they came on it anyway, and they still didn't like poetry at the end, which is quite funny because I don't think you're going to love poetry if you don't love it in an hour and a half or whatever. But have you had anything even more surprising than that?
In a way, what I want from all these groups is people to come who don't like poetry, but then maybe at the end
they're slightly
really like
warmed
it
up
a bit
yeah.
more. And that's the kind of challenge in a way of a lot of people just like, this poetry's not for me. Didn't like it at school, not, but sometimes when you get somebody like that in your group and then you don't even have to do much, read it a couple of times, have a chat, and it's like, the penny drops, or they somehow can connect with it. And that's very rewarding.
And I think it is, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's sometimes that it isn't that they dislike it. It's more that they fear it, or that they are uncomfortable with it or something. It's not quite dislike, I would say, because it's a funny thing to say that you dislike an entire medium.
Yes. I think there is a lot of fear, a lot of sort of hang-ups, and I have them myself. I think it's only through this process really that I've come to really kind of enjoy. And you
studied poetry at undergraduate level as well.
Yes, exactly.
And you still feel like that.
Yes. I've got the enjoyment back, I think, from doing this and from this sort of shared endeavour that and the fact that there's not really an expert in the room. So I facilitate, but I don't have the answers, and sometimes I deliberately make sure I don't know, stuff about the poem, so that they can't ask me about, I can just say, genuinely, I don't know. So that there's a sense of kind of puzzling something out together, and that kind of gives it a shared ownership. Yeah, it's always surprising who comes to the groups. Yeah, it's exciting. Sometimes they don't always work out well. And also you just never know. Maybe I hope that person who still didn't like poetry still might have got something out of it.
Well, hopefully.
So yeah, and I went on a London walk this weekend, and we started in Hanover Square, and I read Amy Levy's poem, A London Plane Tree, and I did the thing where I matched it all up. So we were standing under a London plane tree, and I read out the poem. And yeah, you're in a public space. It's you've never met these people. It is slightly embarrassing. They maybe looked a bit embarrassed, but as I said, just soak it in. And then at the end, when we got to the Poetry Pharmacy, we were running the walk in collaboration with them. We were having our coffee, and this guy came up to me and said, when I'd been reading the line about sort of, I can't remember what the line is now, but the rustle of the trees, he said, the trees were rustling right at that moment that you were reading that, and I hadn't noticed because I was busy concentrating. But he got that, and it made it was like a special moment, and I just thought, yes, that's why it's good to read outside.
Yeah, site specific. I like it very much. Just to slightly change the subject a little bit, I'm fascinated by the fact that you are also an anthologist. And you've also done a Taylor Swift themed anthology, which will obviously appeal to lots of people. One of my favourite etymological facts is that anthology means like word flowers, and it's like a collection of the flowers of verse. I think that's just so beautiful. And I think sometimes anthologies are slightly dismissed as being, not serious enough and things like that. So maybe you could just defend anthologies for us.
Yes, that etymology is lovely. Well, I suppose that all the things that talking about today are kind of about trying to develop a kind of personal relationship with poetry, almost treat it like a living thing. I think as we were talking about in the pub, it was becoming it's a living entity there, and it's on the page, we've got to try and make it kind of come to life a bit. So I suppose I see the anthologies that I've done as kind of an extension of that. So sort of giving people a way into poetry by giving them a sample, a range. Yeah, so I feel like they are really important. I mean, I think that could have a whole conversation about this. I'd be interested to know what you think as well, because are they as important as they used to be? I mean, now we have access. There's so much, you can get all out of copyright stuff online. There's so almost too much. So in fact, in a sense, you need anthologies even more in order to
know where to start.
Yeah,
maybe.
Exactly, because there's so much out there. So the Taylor Swift one is an interesting one because it comes from a very, very different angle, trying to choose poems that kind of relate to her songwriting, her lyrics. And Taylor Swift is, I mean, she is the best advocate of all for poetry really at the moment, because she's got, you know, millions of fans who are basically being like
hanging off her every word, essentially.
Yeah, they're like literary critics, aren't they? But with the sort of the best,
to read into her lyrics all the time.
But they do it like I imagine the best literary critic, you know, with love and with attention and with expertise and care, because they know everything about her and they know how the songs relate to each other. And there are also a lot of literary references to Shakespeare and The Great Gatsby and Secret Garden, all sorts of things. So there was so it was a kind of ripe for a poetry anthology.
And how long did it take you to do it? I mean, I would imagine it's quite a time-consuming job.
I mean that one there was quite a tight turnaround. But yeah, it does take time, and there were I guess the publisher had in mind about like kind of reflecting the era's love and heartbreak. So it kind of gave me some a focus.
And did your daughter help you with it? Or not really?
Well, yeah, I have two teenage daughters and a teenage son. They're all pretty much into Taylor Swift. So we'd kind of been living with it for a bit. So I did know something about it beforehand. And I think since I've had, I think my credibility amongst their friends has kind of, you know, increased a little bit. So yeah, so I actually kind of feel quite serious about it, because I think I'd hope that this is another way of getting young people into poetry. You know, it's almost, you know, they're already into it really. So it's a bit of fun as well.
We were talking to Deb actually on this podcast in another episode, and she was talking about how she'd had a little bit of kind of negative pushback from more serious poetry communities about her projects and, you know, the Poetry Pharmacy, but also the way that she's now compiling anthologies based on emotion and those kinds of things. And in her opinion, anything that gets poetry out there is fine and important, but sometimes like more serious poetry communities can really push back against that. Have you found anything like that, or has it largely been positive?
Yeah, I don't think I've had too much negative feedback, but I can imagine that would be the case. Yeah, as I say, I don't really sort of steer away from old, difficult poetry. And there's some in, you know, we've got Coleridge, Ancient Mariner, and I put some John Milton in it because the serpent is a big Taylor Swift symbol. So why not have, you know, the original serpent?
And I think it's sometimes quite condescending to think that people who are new to poetry wouldn't be able to read more difficult poetry, or at least get something from it.
That's right, and that's that thing about not making assumptions about people. So I think the popular way, I don't know if you've talked also about social media, and I mean, it's taken me a bit of a while to kind of get into that, but there's so much content out there, which I think, again, brings new audiences in, and I think we've got to be open-minded about these things, and, you know, embrace the, well, they're not even new, are they?
No.
The technologies probably, so, you know, I mean, they're not quite on the TikTok level yet, but you know, can do Instagram.
Well, I think maybe in the poetry world as well, it's not that different from when 200 years ago people would share their poems around the fire or whatever.
Yes,
you know, the oral tradition.
idea.
It's not that different. It's a sharing community, essentially, isn't it? Because I just talked to Brian Bilston, and he was talking about that, about actually how the positive sides of social media are things like sharing and, you know, being quite open with your poetry rather than really, you know, got a real gatekeeper, you know, who's very guarded. That actually this is a different way of thinking about poetry, and maybe that might be one of the things that is annoying the more traditional avant-garde, because people are actually almost just giving this stuff for free, or so it feels. Whereas traditionally, you know, you have to get past the Faber copyright and the Penguin copyright to even cite it.
Yes.
And you've got the 70 years of copyright and all of that, which I'm sure you know about from your anthology.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is a very different type of attitude towards it. Something that's shared, that's owned by a community, really.
I just wanted to go back, actually, to what you just said, remind me about, saying about the reading aloud and performance poetry. But the other thing that is very popular at the moment, which I think is great, is you can go to these performances of famous actors reading out.
Oh yeah, I've been to one of
on.
those actually.
So Judi Dench,
really good. Yeah.
And those are wonderful, and that's poetry getting heard. But it's also it's that idea of the expert again, the professional reader.
Yes.
When we read in the groups, it's kind of very different from that. I mean, I sort of sometimes hesitate, stumble over words. I kind of, I'm great at the imperfection element of it. And I think that encourages other people.
Yeah.
So if you get people who maybe never read a poem aloud.
And also, some poets read their poems really badly. It's not a natural skill, I would think.
But it's a sort of thing, it's quite empowering when sometimes people come to a group and they may not say much or they may not want to read, but after maybe a few weeks they might take
people
the plunge
doing it. Yeah.
And that's because it's not like there's like a it's not a performance.
No.
And then it's actually really empowering to hear and to be heard.
And sometimes perhaps people might not often really hear their own voice used in a creative way. Even that might be a barrier in itself. If you're someone who's quite quiet, you might just find even that quite terrifying. But it's good that over a few weeks they warm up to it. That sounds wonderful.
For me, that's one of the best things, is to hear sort of these beautiful words read by different people. It's also internalizing, isn't it, that they're actually speaking those words.
It's so interesting you say about those readings, because I went to one not that long ago which was for Ukraine, and Tom Hiddleston was one of the readers, and it was I would say 99% women under 40 audience. I'm sure Tom Hiddleston had something to do with it. Yeah, I don't think they would have turned up if it was just you or me on the stage.
Yes, yeah.
So I suppose, again, that is a way to get people into poetry.
Yes, that's the trouble. You see, that you've got a full hall.
Yeah.
Whereas when you come to one of my
packed,
groups and in the drafty church hall and only 3 or 4 people turn up, and you think, is this the right way to go about it? But
I think what was really interesting about that was that he actually wasn't the best reader, I would say. The chap Asa Butterfield, the one who's in Sex Education, he was amazing. And you would just never know who was going to be the most kind of could deliver it really effectively. I felt like he was really charming in a very like non-effacing way. It was really interesting.
Oh, that sounds good.
So we're just going to wind up a bit. We could talk about this forever, but I'm just wondering, for someone wanting to get into poetry, do you have a poem or a poet that you would recommend?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. One of the poems that I take to, like if I'm doing a taster session, is by Sarah Teasdale. It's called Barter, and it's just quite a simple poem, but it's just about life has loveliness to sell. It's kind of a really sort of feel-good poem, and it always generates really a nice discussion, a nice feel in the room. So I would definitely recommend that.
That's great, because often people think that poetry is very negative, or that it has to be negative to be serious.
Yes, it doesn't have to be all tortured poet stuff, does it?
No, it doesn't. Thank you so much to Liz. If people want to find out more about you and your projects, where can they go?
I've got an Instagram account, liz.ison, ISON, and
that's the best place to go.
That would be great.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to all of our listeners. See you next time on Demystifying Poetry.